Yes,
I have to
yes,
say to you.
yes, yes.
I think you should tell the story of how you first got interested in accounting history, and since then, he has learned so much. It's absolutely astonishing. And his book is available online and also, since they closed, maybe they sold out at the Historical Society bookstore. But it is a view that is not constrained by classified information. Everything is public information that you have found. And he has found a lot of amazing things, and tonight he's going to talk about the most recent of your many findings. There's a copy, Nancy, if you want to, which you can order from Amazon, right?
What is it called?
Atom Bombs. Catchy title.
And what was your name?
Oh, his name is John Coster-Mullen.
Yes. You sure give the hyphen in. My wife would kill me. Thank you for all being here. First off, I'd like to thank Coster-Mullen and Suzette for inviting me here today. It is a great honor, and I'm deeply humbled to be here at this most historic of buildings. And when I think of what happened here and how many ideas were fostered and born between all those dinner and cocktail parties that they had here, there were a lot of intense conversations that took place between various scientists, and so many ideas were sparked and things that moved this entire project ahead by leaps and bounds. If you think of it today, 2.5 years from start to finish, they could never do anything like that today. It could never happen. Let me get into some of this. In 1999, the world's journalists were polled, and that the atomic bombing was the single most important event of the 20th century. As has been mentioned a few. I want to state at the outset for the record that I've never had a clearance nor taken a security oath. I have never conducted espionage, paid for information, or misled or tricked anyone into providing me with information. Nobody has ever slipped me anything classified. All of what you're about to hear and see came entirely from open, declassified, unclassified, and non-classified sources. If I thought for a microsecond any of this information could be injurious in any way to our great country, I certainly would never have disclosed any of it. However, to my surprise, I've discovered that all of this information was merely hiding in plain sight. I have discovered that these barn doors were flung open many long decades ago when those horses are galloping all over the planet. As I have stated many times, if they don't want us to know any of this stuff, perhaps they should stop telling us. I have been working diligently for almost a quarter of a century researching my book, which you just saw, Atom Bombs, a top secret inside story of Little Boy and Fat Man. I stumbled into that. I was not intending on writing a book, and it started with this little pamphlet, and now it's 425 pages. I don't know when to stop. I've been acutely aware that it contains many orders of magnitude more information than what earned Ethel and Julius Rosenberg their flaming rides to Valhalla aboard Sing Sing's old Sparky electric chair back in 1953. In December of 1944, Colonel Paul Tibbets formed the 509th Composite Group specifically to train air crews to deploy these as yet undeveloped atomic weapons simultaneously on both Germany and Japan. At their Wendover reunion in 2001, I was in a group of 6 historians that the surviving veterans voted to make permanent honorary members of that most prestigious air group. I have screen credit in a dozen documentaries and appear in 3 of them. Several dozen authors and scholars have cited my work in their books and articles. In 2012, and this one really gives me pause for thought, the National Archives opened up a collection of my papers, which are now housed permanently at the Harriet Truman Presidential Library. I really have a hard time wrapping my brain around that. Long after I'm gone, my papers sit in the same boxes on the same shelves as President Truman's in their glass-proof vault. They allowed me to stand at the entrance to that vault the last time I was there. I could not go in the vault, so the person walked down and went into my boxes and said, they're right here. I'm just happy that they're there. If you want the details of how I conduct my research, read the major cover story, Atomic John, that ran in the New Yorker in December 2008. It's available free online. Articles about me and my work have appeared in many publications, including New York Times, Washington Post, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, Scientific American, Smithsonian Air and Space, and plenty of others. You can even watch me in a YouTube video because I've been a truck driver for the past 20 years. There's a YouTube video, Atomic Trucker. And it's, yeah, I can show you what I drive and have been driving for the past 18 years, but a certain company won't let me. My trucking company says it's okay, and they could mention it in that New Yorker article, but the actual company that I work for, that I drive trucks for, I showed it to John last night, and he understands. There's quite an in-joke connected with it. If someone had told me this when I began this research decades ago, what I would experience, discover, and witness, I would have told them they were completely out of their minds. We have so little time to cover and so much, so let's get into it. I enjoyed, as I mentioned, a 30-year career as a professional corporate industrial photographer. I learned to see things differently. I was exposed to a myriad of industrial processes. I saw how things were developed, from concept to prototype to finished product. Clients would come to me with an idea locked in their heads, and I'd have to dig that idea out and onto a piece of film they could then take to a printer to put ink on paper. Thus, I identified with the Manhattan Project scientists, engineers, and especially the machinists who constantly had what they referred to as the eggheads come into their shops with an idea, and they would have to leave much later with a prototype created out of plastic or aluminum, and they would kick that back and forth, back and forth, back and forth until they developed something they could finally make the testing phase. This process was literally repeated thousands of times over the course of the 2.5 years of that Manhattan Project. What is astounding is that all of this was created with no computers at all, merely slide rules and chalk on blackboards. I think the most thing they had were Marchand calculators, which were just glorified motorized adding machines. If nothing else, I'm the epitome of the old saying, chance favors the prepared person. I was quite literally the right person at the right time. I got these people at the end of their lives when they still could remember things. I met with one of my original sources yesterday in Albuquerque who just turned 95, and he is as sharp as a tack. I have delivered talks as this around the world and traveled over 100,000 miles to conduct my research, which I have labeled nuclear archaeology. Those words. Any of you want to contact me, that's my email address. I have business cards up here if anybody's interested. Feel free, contact me at any time. I'll send you a whole host of free stuff. That's the cover of the book. Nuclear archaeology I define as this. It also involves physical examination, interviewing sources, going over all of the records. That's Harold Agnew and I, late Harold, I miss him, on Tinian together in 2005. We were there for the 60th commemorative events, and they brought out people from the Manhattan Project, Project Alberta, the scientists that went to Tinian, the 509th. They also brought in Japanese Army and Navy, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hibakusha, and we all met in peace and friendship out there on the island. And we were there for almost a week. This is what Harold, he promised me that I would never say that Harold Agnew says your book is accurate. However, 2 months later, he conducted this interview, and I'll let you decide whether or not he thinks my book is accurate. He wanted to bring me back, and the current director, he tried to persuade that in, said he was horrified, but no, he wouldn't do it. So I'm still here if anybody wants to quiz. This is from Howard Moreland, who was taken to federal court in 1979 to prevent the publication of his book, The Secret That Exploded. Now, the New Yorker article, there's a statement in there where I said I view the world with a jaundiced eye. That's one of the reasons why. At some point, I kept finding out information was wrong, people's memories were bad, some people had memories that are almost as bad as mine. And I eventually wound up starting with a blank sheet of paper from scratch and doing all of what I learned. Now, for those of you who've never seen one, the small one in the front is Little Boy, the large one is Fat Man. These were taken at Bradbury a long time ago. That Little Boy is now sitting inside the Imperial War Museum. What you can't see is right here, there's a hole in the front. And when it was shipped to England back in the 90s, the hole was still there. And I was able to go inside with a TV camera and find out what was inside. Nobody ever imagined that such things would be invented in the future, and what we saw was described in the New Yorker. By the way, that took 22 months from the time I was first contacted by the author until the article appeared. The interview, by the way, was 1 week long, 3,200 miles, with the writer sitting right here with a notepad in his lap and a microphone hung over the rearview mirror, 15 hours a day in a car, driving out to Wendover, Utah, which is where my Little Boy is, housed, my full-scale replica. If you think that isn't pressure, think again. This is the implosion weapon of the Fat Man. It's made out of duraluminum, which is actually this is a piece of that, not that sphere, but one of the test units. Here's another piece, and it actually has the numbers cast into it, the model numbers. And this is a piece of the cork lining that was on the underside of that to compress the explosives. They're covered with detonators, which you can see right here. There were backups for the backups for the backups. Each detonator was actually 2 detonators. This is a large, basically electrical, that sent the 5,600 volt charge to all 32 of those detonators. These cubes right here and down here were cast into the central section, and that was what they attached the front and rear armored shells for the Fat Man. Very incredibly ingenious. In fact, I have tremendous respect for the ingenuity of these people who did this. It's mind-boggling the more I got into it. I would look at something and go, who thought of that? This is one of those detonators. This is one that was inert, that was loaned to me many years ago, and I took a lot of measurements and casting. This is now, you can see one that's on display over at the Bradbury. That's the inside cross-section. The detonators were actually down here at the bottom, the bridge wires that exploded, and this chain went all the way up through the top, and there's a copper cap on the one that's over at the Bradbury. That's what it looks like on the inside. The bridge wires were actually right here, and when they exploded, that's what started the process. What was incredible was that they were able to build these by hand, and each one had to go off within a microsecond of the other. That's a millionth of a second. Today we have no problem with computer-aided machining and design and manufacturing. These were handmade by a group of people who did it the same way each time. In fact, they were women, and one of them was Abraham Lincoln's ancestor, Ava Loudon Lincoln.
Descendant.
Right? Descendants, yes, excuse me. Did I misspeak again? The bridge wire went in right between here, and that one's got a little dent in the plastic, so I think it was already exploded. This is the inside of that firing set. And what's interesting is surrounding the exterior of this, how they got the voltage out of this thing and over to all those wires, they used aircraft spark plugs. Why reinvent everything? And since spark plugs take high voltage and are insulated and can survive pressure, it was just made for it, because this was actually under pressure and it's sealed. And there are the actual spark plugs around the perimeter. And this is showing they're about to slide it into, that's the front ballistic shell. And there you can see that I actually have one of these cubes, this flange, the bolt, and one of the 3/8 inch thick armored steel from underneath that. We'll get into that a little later. This, of course, is the famous photo of Norris Bradbury. There are lots of extra things on here. The detonators are just this part right here. With these circular objects going to these boxes were only for the Trinity test. They were trying to determine, they didn't trust the detonators, they didn't trust them to work, so each one of those sent a signal in that millionth of a second before the whole thing vaporized back to the control tower 10,000 yards away to tell them which detonators worked and which ones didn't. I don't know if they ever got any decent records off of that, but obviously the test was a success. There's another shot that's actually John Horning, was a scientist from Wisconsin. Now, this is a side view, and that two polar caps, one at the top and the bottom, and then the 5 sections through the middle. This is a cross-section that I created to show you what is inside. You've got the detonators, and I only have one set and one set of explosive lenses. There's a detonator, would start the lens exploding, and if you think of it like ripples in a pond, when you drop a pebble in, it was convex waves that came out, and what it did was it hit this slower explosive, it wrapped around and changed it from a convex to a concave wave. So when it emerged out the bottom, it was completely symmetrical. The next layer, now there's another layer of fast explosives here. The next layer right here is what they call the pusher that evened out the shock wave that it was moving through, and there's some other reasons for it, but I don't want to get into that. This other section here, this is what they call the tamper reflector. It was 8 3/4 inches in diameter, made out of uranium, natural uranium, not U-235. And how they assemble this, there's the pavilion core with the initiator inside. These lines here, they took that sphere, they hollowed out a central core, they built a slug, as they call it, out of uranium, split it in half, and that's what they assembled in the McDonald Ranch House. And then slid it in from the top during the assembly on the bottom of the base of the tower. Now there's showing the explosive blocks. This is not the completed, this is not the finished version with the 2 sets of lenses and inner charges, but it gives you an idea, and that is the large aluminum pusher with everything else inside. There's a different version of the same 72 block design without the outer shell. And there, of course, is the famous picture of Herb Blair walking through the front door of the McDonald Ranch House. If many of you have visited the Trinity site, this is on the tour. And that's the magnesium carrying case that Ellen described. Inside is the plutonium core. Now, as a photographer, I was always trained not to leave your camera bag with the flash bulbs somewhere in the shot. But this is very descriptive, because that's Oppie's hat hanging on the wall, and there's Phil Morrison's cane hanging over the back of the chair. We don't quite know who that is. I'm also surprised, as I found out a month ago, that Los Alamos still has no accurate record of who was in the ranch house for that assembly. Now there's Louis Alvarez, and there were a whole bunch of people who had their picture taken, including Harold Agnew, holding that magnesium carrying case out on Tinian. Harold's slide when the security people came and wanted, just fishing expedition. What have you got? We know you got something. And I have the slide. So his famous photograph is he took it and crossed it out on his slide. But this is one where you can see it. Now, this is the criticality testing room in Los Alamos, and what you're supposed to see is this part right here. But I, as a photographer, look at everything in the photograph. What's on the floor, what's on the shelf, what's laying, everything else. Right here is a ball, and that is the push. That is the actual tamper sphere, and you can see the hole bored all the way through it that they slid that slug into. That was for the assembly, and they did that on Tinian also. That's the actual slug. That's the one that they assembled. This was actually a photo taken underneath the Trinity Tower after they had delivered the assembled slug, and they were going to insert it. This is a replica that was presented to me last year along with the carrying case. It gives you roughly an idea of what the thing looked like. It splits in half, and you can see one of the rings that assembles it on the side. This is what it looked like inside. Our conjecture, of course. I don't know for sure because I've never seen the inside of the real one. But the plutonium core, these are the rings that attached here and here. And what they did was, when they took the core apart, they had to put an initiator inside, which kick-started the reaction at the very end. And, see if I can get this straight. They also had, there's the initiator, and they had gold foil gaskets. Well, when they got to the ranch huts, there were the top people, the top physicists there, and many of them, it was the first time they'd all been together in the presence of this object. So everybody had their idea of how this went together. Now, Ellen mentioned Ramer Schreiber, as we call him. I said, this took a couple hours to put together. Didn't you just put the plutonium inside, put the two halves together, and put the rings in and uranium screws? And when he finished laughing, Schreiber said, no. He said, you have a lot of very nervous people in that room. And this is the culmination of 2.5 years of the Manhattan Project. If this test was not a success, there were going to be major problems. I will show you a little boy, that was a guaranteed success. Even if everything failed and it struck the ground, it was going to explode. Fat metal, on the other hand, even if it hit the ground, the explosives might not have even detonated, and if they did, it would not be a simultaneous explosion, and they wouldn't have had a nuclear event. So I asked, what'd you do? How did this go together? Well, first you can't see it, but there's a little bit of fake gold foil underneath there. They decided, okay, they were trying to prevent what they call jetting, which is like capillary reaction, to keep that, when all of those detonators explode, and that compression, that shock wave starts moving in, it's moving at about 25,000 feet per second. And ahead of it, weaker, but still moving faster, are jets, like capillary reaction, going between all the seams and between the blocks, the cracks in the pusher sphere, and anywhere there's an opening that one of these jets might get through and get all the way down and rupture that initiator long before it should have been, and this would have resulted in a fizzle. So they were coming up with last minute, everybody had their ideas about how this was getting put together. So Cyril Smith, who was the metalworker, decided, well, let's put some gold foil in there, that'll stop a jet. Then they had a lot of those gaskets to go around to lay in there, and do we put in 1, 2, 3, 100? And everybody had their ideas about how that would go together. They finally got that in, they put that in. Then they were left with this very large surface here, and nobody had made a gasket for it. So they cut gold foil up into little squares and started laying them around, overlapping, all the way around. And of course, okay, we got one layer, should we do more? And they kept going and going and going and going, till finally everybody agreed, it's done. Then they picked up the other half and assembled it. Now when I say picked it up, these are steel, and I can tell you they're very heavy. Uranium, which is what this was made of, these were 45 pounds apiece. So they had a chain hoist, and they're very carefully lowering it, and there were all sets of eyeballs watching that go down, and they were afraid that the foil would pop out. They put the rings in, screwed them down, tightened everything, and then they pulled on all those pieces, and a lot of them came out. They laid them down all the way around. They had a lot of gold foil, so they had to take it apart very carefully, raise it up. This went back and forth, putting more gold foil and more and more and more, until finally none of them came out when they assembled it. They then had a micrometer to measure the thickness of that core, of that slug versus that diameter, and they found out it was too thick. So they had to open it apart, take it apart again, take some more out. This is what went back and forth, said that's what took them several hours. Finally, it was all, everything worked. They took a razor blade, trimmed it all off, put it on that back in that litter. There's one of the actual gold foil gaskets. That's hanging on the wall in the Smithsonian. I doubt that anybody even knows what it is or looks at it. There's the initiator, maybe what the inside is. And last month, I was at a conference, and one of the speakers at the conference showed this wonderful paperweight. And in the paperweight are these pieces of trinitite from the Trinity test. What made this unique, however, was the mold that they created this in, pouring the resin in and dropping the trinitite. was the very same mold that was used to cast the plutonium cores for the Trinity device. Now, I have to believe there's more than one of these floating around. This happened to be one, and Alex Wellerstein posted this immediately. We and Ray Smith and a couple other people, we vaulted to the podium after he finished his talk to measure it, and I got new measurements, and they're now on my board. I never know when my research is stalled, or something will drop out of the skies, and I'm off and running again. Obviously, his name tag is on there, and I sort of crossed that out a little bit. But that hole, this is the hole there for the initiator. And so I very accurately measured the actual. Now this is, that's Herb again, Herb Blair again. That's Harry Dalian. Nobody knows. I asked last month at the lab. Nobody knows who this gentleman is or the name of the guard. And if you blow these up, they've got security badges, so there must be a record somewhere of who these people are. They put it in the back of that 42 Plymouth. If any of you have been out at the ranch house, the Trinity test is actually like 8 o'clock or position over in that direction, 2 miles away. You can see the obelisk at ground zero from this place, 2 miles away with the naked eye. Here's the Trinity device underneath the tent, and there, of course, there's the container with the slug. That's Herb Blair again. We don't know who this is, but this is a Canton crane that they use to lower that sphere. So now they've changed the polar cap to one that has a funnel in it to take out the block so they can lower it down into that core. Here they are changing the polar cap. There's Oppie on the left, making sure everything's working okay. And there they are lowering it into place. There's Harry Dolly, Herb Blair, Louis Slotin, and that's Marshall Holloway. You can see the very top of that core being lowered in. Now, those were the best and the brightest. These were the top people. They had tried to imagine everything that could have taken place. What nobody took into account was that the plutonium was warm. If you hold, I've never held a core, but it's warm. That slug started expanding in the middle. Heat expands. Not very much, but it was just enough to be an interference fit. So when they lowered it in, it stuck. And that, I think, is the point when they asked Oppie to go take a cigarette break outside the tent. We'll figure out what's going on and just relax. Well, Schreiber told me that they had to wait about half an hour. And what happened was, this whole thing had been under the tent overnight in the relatively cool New Mexico evening, so it had cooled down. The core, the slug, which of course was still warm, so a half hour later, that uranium sphere sucked the heat out of that, and it contracted just enough so a half hour later they let the pressure off and it descended. And of course we all know the test was a wonderful success. Now when they got the Fat Man assembled here for the very first time, all the components, everything fit minus the plutonium, of course, they all took their turns standing on top of like this, and the security people got very upset and confiscated. There are two different people. These photographs are floating around. That's the head of security. So the people above him were the ones who got upset. And you can see Bugs Bunny on the sign that says explosives handled with care, etc. They're little attempts at humor. This is the actual F-31 combat Fat Man, fully assembled without the plutonium, here at Los Alamos before it was shipped on the airplane out to Tinian. Now this is Tinian. This is what it looked like in 1945, and right there is a B-29. These are the 3 assembly buildings. The loading pits are right here. The Project Alberta, which is all of the Los Alamos scientists and their Quonset huts were here. All the rest of these little dots are hundreds of hard stands for the B-29s that were there. The 4 parallel runways. This is the one that both combat planes took off from. I spent a week on Tinian with Harold in 2005. There are crash sites, B-29 crash sites all over that island. There are B-29s, dozens and dozens of them, in the ocean at the bottom with their crews still inside. They would have problems during takeoff, they'd auger in and they couldn't get anybody out to rescue them, and they sank. And the crash sites are big pieces and pieces down to the tip of a pencil lead. And if you just sit and stare, long enough, you see bits of colored plastic and aluminum, and I'm sorry to say, bits and pieces of bones. Now this is another view. This was taken by my late friend Leon Smith. There's runway Able again. Some B-29s. The 509th area is up here. These are the Project Alberta areas, and you can see the roadway going over. They flew the B-20, they taxied them over here. These are the two loading pits. There's one, there's one. This left one was actually the only one that was used. When it got out to Tinian, they had it mislabeled. One is Little Boy and one is Fat Man. And on the airplane, I was able to go over all the photographs I had. And when I got to Tinian, I proved for them that the West Pit was used for both weapons. Up here are the three assembly buildings. The first one at the bottom is Little Boy. The second one was used for all the Fat Man test units. And the top one up there was only for the combat weapon. This is what that same area looked like in 2005. The jungle has completely overtaken all of Tinian. There are the assembly buildings, and they have earthen berms around them for visual security, and also in case something happens, only the shock wave will go out if they're assembling explosives out into the ocean. This is the Fat Man assembly building. You can see the berm around it. This is in 1945. This is what it looks like 5 years ago. That's Professor Anderson, Giles, and myself. Believe it or not, we're standing on the concrete floor of that assembly building. It's completely, the jungle has completely overtaken all of this. This is the Fat Man being, they're sealing it out in front of that assembly building. There's some people signing all sorts of wonderful things on the bomb. What I want, oh, too bad, I can't go back. Okay. This is one of the loading pits. They literally wheeled the bomb over that. This is a Joyce Cridlin automobile lift that was in every service station in the United States. 2 years ago, I found out that Joyce Cridlin, when we had our reunion in Dayton, was the manufacturer, was actually from Dayton. I contacted the president of the company, who's now their historian, he's retired. He knew nothing about this, even though these were, and it says Cridlin on this, Joyce Cridlin on the air tank. He was blown away that their company had been involved in this. They never knew. This is to show you, give you a sense of scale of that pit. They now have glass covers over the top to protect them. The air tank obviously was over on the side. And this is the Fat Man actually being taken over the top. There it is. You can see the hydraulic lift at the bottom. They're about ready to take those stands off and then lower it into place. There it's being lowered. And this is what it looked like inside a B-29. It had to be shoehorned in there. It used almost every cubic inch of that bomb bay. And of course, Nagasaki was successful. I don't want to get into the missions, there isn't time. This is assembly building number 1 on Tinian. This is L for Little Boy. Test bomb number 1 and number 2, L1 and L2. These were assembled there, and what they're doing on these particular units is testing all of the stuff that was here back, and that's all the radars and proximity radars and fusing and so on. This front part here, 36-inch long, that's what they call the target case. That's where the physics package was located. In the case of these two weapons, they didn't use an actual physics package case. They used what they call a dummy case, which, why should we use all this expensive machining and individual parts when all we're doing is testing that other stuff. Now there's, with the side plates off, these are battery boxes. By the way, this was incredibly ingenious because they screwed the gun tube into that target case. It was about a 6-foot long artillery gun tube. And everything, from the back of that case to the tail, was attached to that gun tube. Everything was bracketed to it, attached to it, clamped to it. Battery boxes, there's the crude computer. Proximity radar would have gone here. Here's one that did. And then there's the clock box. The battery's a little bit tighter shot. There's the actual gun tube you see going into the tail section, and those were tubes that they used to transmit cables and whatnot to the back end during the testing phase. This is the Assembly Building #1 on Tinian in 1945. This is what it looked like in 2005, 60 years later. That's Harold again standing in front of it. We asked him, is this what he remembered? He said, actually, I remembered it was a lot bigger. Well, you know, when the building isn't there, that little floor looks like absolutely nothing. And you can see the berm behind it now completely covered by the jungle. This drawing was sent to me, I believe, by mistake from the lab in 1995. I immediately called them up and I said, I think you made a boo-boo here. And the person on the other end said, well, if we send it to you, then it must be okay, so go ahead and keep it. And I did. And what they're showing you here is this cutaway part. The gun tube went all the way through, and this crosshatch section is what they call the gun tube adapter. They found out if they screwed the gun in the initial testing, when the shock of firing got to the front, it fractured that case. Things broke, so that gun tube adapter was kind of an intermediate thing that would absorb the shock of firing. It also, this bracket, this back part here is what they clamped all the battery boxes to, so that's 2 uses. We found out that the front, when I went in with the TV camera, that the front face has big slots cut into it. And one of the people told me, I said, well, as that projectile is moving forward, if this is a closed system, what's happening to the air? Isn't it being compressed at the same time it's being pushed? It's like a piston in an automobile engine. Isn't that trying to slow it down? He said, well, it was atmospheric pressure to begin with. It was such a non-problem that nobody worried about it. Well, over the past 20+ years, I turned that drawing into this. And this is my latest version, which is in my book. This part back here is the projectile. It's 16 1/4 inches long. These are the powder bags. This is the breech plug with the primers in it. Goes a long way down and combines with the uranium here, and these are 13-inch rings. That's that same tamper reflector material that was used in the Fat Man weapon, only instead of being uranium, this was tungsten carbide. And when it was fired, it went about 52 inches down the gun tube. Now, because this is all secret, and I have no idea why that was a hollow projectile with 9 rings in it, female projectile going over a male target, which was different. That's what Howard Moreland described, that everybody's version was wrong. This was sent to me last year. If you notice, they're talking about plating the inner cylindrical surface of the projectile rings and the outer cylindrical surface of the target rings. In other words, the hollow projectile design. And this was declassified, I believe in the 1980s. Now, one of the things I found out was that the rings were 13 inches in diameter, and that took a long time. I won't describe how I found that out. But this was sent to me last year also, that had also been declassified from 1947, and they talked about, they created 10 tungsten carbide rings, 13 inches in diameter. So here, in a Los Alamos document, like I said, it's all hiding in plain sight. Now there's the little boy that had been at the Bradbury. You can't quite make it out, but here's the 1-inch hole that's open. And I tried to imagine everything that I would see when I pushed that camera in. What I didn't tell the New Yorker writer who was next to me and my son, who helped me build my replica, was that another amateur archaeologist by the name of Howard Carter lived about 1 kilometer from the Imperial War Museum. And I imagined, not really, but some people think I'm crazy, that he was standing next to me watching the little TV camera, or little TV screen. Because in 1922, when he pulled the last brick out from the inside of King Tut's tomb, which he had just discovered, and another amateur, somebody asked him when he shined the flashlight inside what he saw, and his 2-word response was wondrous things. And so I imagined that he was whispering in my ear, find those wondrous things. And what I found out when I pushed it aside was this, that it contained those large slots. Now I have a machinist friend of mine whose grandfather actually made, or machined, not made, but machined the tungsten carbide blocks that were used in the Iridali and criticality of the fatal experiment. And so he's got a personal interest in this. He's creating a 1/6 scale model in steel of Little Boy. So this is his version of that adapter. You can see the vent slots. The projectile is flying forward through here, and as that air is coming in, it went out these slots. And I didn't find out until 6 months later when I shipped the camera back to a colleague at the University of London, and he ran it inside for me again, just to double check. Only he went down, the camera went down into one of these slots, and it kept bumping against it, and I had no idea what it was. It took me a while to figure out what I was seeing, not slots, but actually the threads, the Acme threads on the interior of the case. Those slots then went to the back. And there was a document that talked about, here's what it looks like. There's the gun tube, the adapter, this is a scale model again, and the back of the target case. Though there's 2 of the 4 slots. They had to make plugs to fit in there because they were afraid that if they had to jettison Little Boy, that it would turn this into a nuclear reactor, which either would or would not have operated for a long time at the bottom of the ocean. But this might or might not have been an ecological disaster until somebody developed a submersible that could go to far enough down to retrieve this thing and turn it off. So they talked about in the report, and I didn't fully understand the wording in the report, this was years later until I discovered this, that they were trying to prevent water from getting through the interrupted threads of the adapter. Then I discovered, oh, that's what the interrupted part of the threads were. Now, in the early 1980s, as the expert here referred to it as, they unexpectedly uncovered 4 little boys here at Los Alamos in storage. That reminds me of the first scene, the last scene of the first Raiders of the Lost Ark movie, when they were moving the ark and it had created into that warehouse. Unexpectedly uncovered. I hesitate to think what else hasn't been unexpectedly uncovered. They took the target case, mounted it vertically, and they still, at that time, were not certain, because Little Boy was only used one time, about the neutron outputs to help the people in Hiroshima, the health physicists, determine why radiation was strong in one area and not in others. So they turned this into a nuclear reactor. And here's, that's the actual gun tube, and they're cutting that gun tube down to about 10 inches. And that's when I discovered that, yes, they had Acme threads there also. Wherever it is. I know they're Acme threads because here's one of them. This was retrieved in our nuclear archaeology dig several years ago. This is what it looked like on our stand here at the Criticality Assembly at Carabajillo Canyon. This is the projectile, and they ran it up. They had here's the gun tube adapter, and they shortened the barrel to about 10 inches and ran this up slowly. They had 2 different versions of it. And here's the actual test stand. Those are neutron counters around the perimeter. And right here, again, if they don't want us to see it, stop telling us, stop showing it, is the actual projectile. Now, they never admitted to the gun bore as being 6.5 inches, which is still classified, but I have it in various documents that it is 6.5 inches. There's kind of a blurry blow-up. You can see the projectile. Now, in the nuclear archaeology dig I was on 2 years ago, somebody out looking for meteorites, which are worth more per ounce than gold, stumbled across acres and acres and acres of Little Boy and Fat Man debris. It's somewhere between my house and Japan. It's about as close as I will get. This is the entire front end off Little Boy. They tested these, dropped them from B-29s, wherever it was that they landed in this area. They took them back to the assembly areas, took everything out they wanted to. They brought the target cases back. The Army stuffed them with explosives, which they love doing, and blew them to pieces. Then they bulldozer buried the parts. We found out this was, and for anybody wondering, this is public land now. And we know it's public land because they were setting up for a off-road race course, and we were in the infield. And between the 2 of us, we literally had tons of Little Boy and Fat Man, which is where these objects came from. This is the side view of that, and this is that nose nut that was at the back end. There's an Acme thread there. This is the bottom. The Acme threads went around there. We got the obvious dimensions from this, and I was able to fine-tune my drawing. There's one of the Acme threads falling off, one of these. That's a combat target case. I'm down in the hole. there was actually another fragment on top of that when they buried it in the hole 60, 70 years ago now. And we know it's a target case for the combat weapon because they were kind enough to stamp the actual drawing number on the side Y-1852 on the fragment pieces that we uncovered. There, the two of them matched together. This is where the nose was blown off, that nose that you saw. This is where the lift lug was attached right there. We put the two of them together and we know they're the same piece. This is the inside. We know it's tapered, it's joined here, and then you can see it started to separate out, a larger taper. All of this is in the book, I don't want to bore you with it. The acme threads at the back end are fully exposed, and this one they had removed the gun tube adapter before they blew it up, and so the threads are intact. And we know the length of the back end of the adapter, obviously. This is a piece I've got. This is where the side plates were attached. These were where the acme threads used to be, and then the rest of it starts the interior of the case. And I was able to create this drawing. You can see the taper and all the dimensions again in my book. There's a case they don't talk about. This was the dummy case, and this is the one where the L1 and L2, where they're not testing the nuclear components or if the projectile's going in the way it should and so on. So they made a lot of these dummy cases. This was 1/3. I figure this is about 1,400 pounds. This took the guy about 3 hours with a shovel to uncover. And I was able to pull some dimensions off of it, obviously, and that's my leg on the left. And for the very first time, because the gun bore is still classified even today, even though it's in, I've got numerous reports that have been declassified, they'd say 6.5, and so they've already declassified but realized they shouldn't have, but it's too late now. When I measured the wall thickness, doubled it, subtracted from the outside diameter, and what came up with my little pocket calculator down the hole was 6.5. Now I've been reading that in reports for almost, at that point, 18 plus years. But to actually see that and feel it and run my hand in it and was a very profound moment for me. After we got done doing all of this and I finished hugging it and kissing it and caressing it, thanking it so much for telling me everything that I needed to know, we reburied it for some future nuclear archaeologists to stumble across perhaps centuries from now and wonder if it's a piece of the Roswell UFO. This is the target, this is the dummy case that I meant. There's a 6.5-inch bore. It also gave me the exact length of 18 inches for the tungsten carbide that was in there. Now this is the actual L11, that's Commander Birch and painting L11 on the side. This is in the assembly building, #1. Here it is being wheeled out of the assembly building, ready to get put on the transport carriage. That was Norman Ramsey standing here watching. Norman, if you look at the movie footage, was the only one smart enough to wear a raincoat because it rains there in Tinian constantly. When they were in the building, you could hear the pitter-patter of the rain on the roof, and he was the only one that was smart enough to wear the raincoat. Now here it is over the loading pit. There it is, getting ready to pivot it around. There it is in the pit. And of course, there's one view, there's the other view. What was interesting was, and I forgot to show this, on the Fat Man, they have these green safing plugs which were changed on board both airplanes to red arming plugs. On the Fat Man and on that L1 and L2, they had wire clips that went over those plugs to prevent them from falling out when the bomb was falling. This is the combat unit, and they had no clips. They didn't even have the holes drilled for the clips. That's 3/8-inch armored steel that they would have to go through. There's a close-up. There are no holes. They're not threaded. They did not have clips. Now, Birch and Parsons were absolutely meticulous in their anything to do with the little boy. There's got to be buried in the report there somewhere why they did not use the clips or feel they were necessary. Nobody's been able to tell me. I wish they would someday because it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. I didn't really look at that until I was building my little boy, and do I make clips or not, and I had measured ones at the Smithsonian and had all the dimensions, and then I got to this, and I looked at it and went, wait a minute, the combat unit did not have clips. Why? Don't know. So there it is being raised up. I don't have the other shot, but here's a photographer laying down, and there's another picture where he's looking straight up at it. Yeah, back there, that was the picture that other photographer took. What you're seeing on there, which is what they denied, is this thing is covered with signatures by all the different people that were there who would either go into the assembly building or they did this before it was wheeled out. And there it is. You can see the tail section here. This is inside the Enola Gay Bombay. There's another view. In all of my research, I've tried to put myself where all this stuff happened. I've been to Tinian, I've been to Oak Ridge, I've been toured around here, and I've spent several hours inside the Enola Gay. And when I got there in 2005, I actually was, by sheer happenstance, wound up in the Bombay. And I was then able to figure out what Jepson held onto when he changed the plugs and what Parsons did on the back end. And what you see up here is the bottom of the removable platform that they had. That platform was here and the tail went like this. It was about an inch overlap. I figured out exactly what position he was, and because I built my little boy the year before, I was familiar with every cubic inch of that weapon, and I knew how far he could reach in, what he would bump with his, and I was able to determine exactly how he did that. This is the replica that my son and I built. That's in front of what maybe someday will be the second flying B-29, but Boeing keeps running out of money and they keep shipping a lot of hangars in Wichita to try and put this together. That is Indianapolis survivor Mike Kurla from Chicago. Is one of two Indy vets that I knew, and sadly they're both gone. He, along with 60 other veterans, signed their names on my weapon. Mike was taking a long time, and I finally, when he was done, I walked around to see what he had written. Well, it wasn't just his name. He had also written for the boys at the Indianapolis. And at that point, I got pretty emotional and had to walk completely around that B-29 to get my act together. I had dinner a couple of months before Mike passed away several years ago. When I told him that story, he said, well, you didn't see what happened to me. He said, I stepped back and realized what I had written, and I lost it. And I had to walk outside the hangar and remembering the 881 sailors and his fellow sailors that died. He just happened to have finished his watch on the deck at midnight. The ship was torpedoed 18 minutes later, and he was blown 4 or 5 feet off the deck, and he was one of the lucky 300 and some that survived. 3 days floating in the Pacific, he managed to live, and cigarettes did him in. So I've got this thing about cigarettes because they also killed my younger sister and my mother, and I got to be there when they passed. I got Paul Tibbets to sign it, and I asked him, I want you to sign it where you signed the real one. He said, I never signed the real one. Well, I talked to 2 people who were in assembly building number 1 who saw him coming in with several other officers, and he signed it. He got all the way around the weapon, the nose, and he got over there, and that light bulb went off in his 89-year-old memory. And the tail was on my right, and I must have been right here. So I handed him the pen or the chalk, and he scratched his name on that. When I got done, we chit-chatted for a little bit. I helped him down. He shuffle walked. He had absolutely no balance left. And I'll be damned if I was going to let him fall off that ramp on my watch. And I got down to the bottom, and he stopped, and he turned to me, and he said, John, I hope they realize what you've done here. Good job. And my son happened to be standing next to me. He spent just as much time making the little boy. He claims he made the whole thing, but I've got to put something in. And I asked him if he heard that. He said, yeah. And I said, that's for you too. Now this is the Hiroshima. This is out at Wendover on display. You can see the signatures. This is where Mike signed it right there. It's the USS Indianapolis. That's the Hiroshima Peace Group that flew me out there in 2005 to supposedly inspect this, but actually they wanted to meet the monster, me, who had delivered this awful speech the year before at Wright-Patterson to a crowd of some 600 dinner guests, included one of the Doolittle raid commanders and a bunch of POWs and 2 members of the Enola Gay and the widow of the bombardier. And we got along fine, found out I didn't breathe fire and I wasn't a monster. This is the Hiroshima survivor that came with him. 5 years later in 2010, I stayed at this guy's house. He's from Chicago, and he's lived in Hiroshima as the international director for Hawaii. And 4 months after this, Keijiro Matsushima and I met on Tinian. He came as part along with Harold. The people that came from here to Tinian were, especially the 509 people, were screamed and yelled at for going out there and meeting with those awful Japanese, the enemies. And the Japanese who came were also yelled at by their Hibakushiran colleagues that, you know, how dare you meet with those awful Americans. But we did get together and everything was fine. That's Kay at Wendover. He's looking through the barbed wire area, a large area where they had disassembled, uncrated all the little boy and fat man test units. Shortly after I took this picture, he approached me and said very quietly, "I am grateful for the protection of my country by the nuclear umbrella of the United States during the Cold War." So he's very conflicted. He's happy for that, and he told me in Hiroshima when I stayed, he drove me around Hiroshima, showed me his town, that he's very conflicted. He hates the atomic bomb. He was 2 miles away. He was the same distance from the bomb as the McDonald Ranch House was from the Trinity test. So it's the same 2 miles. He was very conflicted. He hates the bomb, but he also explained to me when we were in Hiroshima, he took me out to Miyajima, which is a big island in the middle, most popular tourist attraction, and he reiterated in graphic detail how much he hates Russia, and because of the proximity, and they still, I believe, I could be wrong, haven't signed the armistice yet for World War II. So technically, they're still at war. They're fighting over the Kuril Islands and a bunch of other stuff. That's Kay in front of the building he worked at as a teenager. That's the Japanese Army clothing depot. He helped put uniforms together and stow them away. You can see the steel shutters on the front of each one of the dozens and dozens of windows that surround the 4 buildings there. A 2-story building. You can see it's like a giant just pushed him in. That's 2 miles away. It shows you the strength of that shockwave that moved across town. This is an aerial view of Hiroshima. This is the T-shape, this is the bridge. There's the roadway that comes up from the Peace Park. That very top right there is the T-shape of the bridge. Tom Farabee told me that why he picked that as an aiming point, because when they were looking down from the cockpit, everybody could see it with the naked eye from 6 miles up, and they all concurred, Parsons and Tibbetts and everybody there, that was indeed Hiroshima. This is the right city. And that famous A-bomb dome is right here. The Hypo Center, where it actually exploded, is about right here. Actually, it's further in, but there's a memorial here on the sidewalk. This is, let's see, here, no, right here. This is what used to be the Shima Clinic. Now it's the Shima Hospital, so that's still there. What's more important is the next bridge down, it takes you about 5 minutes to walk across the bridge, then down the street to that memorial. Right here is a building called the Rest Center. So when you're coming across into Peace Park, you can go in there, they have vending machines and benches where you can sit and relax. In 1945, there was a kimono warehouse. There were about 3 dozen people working in that building. For all practical purposes, I mean, this is about the same distance from the A-bomb dome to the Hypo Center. The bomb went off almost directly overhead. Everybody in that building was killed instantly, like the people in the A-bomb dome, which is a Congress building, exposition center. There was one person, however, who was in the basement getting something. Not only did he survive X-ray, gamma, neutrons, thermal, and shockwave, he lived into his 80s, relatively unhurt. He's the closest known survivor. Like I said, that's part of the bridge. So what I didn't find out was that there's high and low tide here. I grew up near Lake Michigan. We didn't have tides in Lake Michigan, not like that. There's the actual memorial. That says the bomb went off 600 meters directly overhead. I sat there for a half an hour watching. None of the bicyclists, none of the pedestrians, nobody in the car ever gave that a second glance. When Keijiro drove me around Hiroshima, I told him about that. He said, what? He didn't even know that was there. This is a block from the A-bomb dome. Nobody knows that this is there, or very few people. The only people that come by are tourists. So this is the T-shape is actually is right here. High tide, there's the A-bomb dome, and there's that bridge, and that rest center is right there. What I didn't realize was that there's high and low tide. So this is at low tide, and there's the A-bomb dome structure on the left. There's a lot of debris in that river. I pointed out to them at the museum that that's most likely a curved section of the A-bomb dome. They did not know it was there directly underneath, because apparently nobody went by at high tide or low tide. This was 5 years ago. I went into the museum specifically after that, contacted and considered a consultant to them. In fact, I found my book was actually in their research library. That Hibakusha, Keijiro, and the two others that were there presented my book to the mayor when they returned, and who had said, what am I going to do with this? They gave it to the museum. And I found it on the wall, in their library. I told them about this. Last fall, they ran an article in the Hiroshima paper about, we have discovered a piece of the dome in the river. This is 5 years after I told them. So now they're recovering these things. There are other chunks there. Now I sat at low tide. There are some steps there, and I sat there. Well, I just scanned a 1 foot wide section all the way out to the water. I retrieved a whole bunch of stuff that was on the bottom, including some melted objects like telephone pole insulators that were within a couple hundred yards of the Hypo Center. You can come up and examine this. This is actually a piece of roof tile, curved roof tile. This darker section here, the triangular section, this is ceramic. This is heavily bubbled from the heat of Little Boy. This is also within 100 yards of the Hypo Center. On the back, it's signed by Tibbetts, Morris Jepson, Dick Jepson, who armed the Little Boy bomb and helped Parsons, and Don Albury, who was the co-pilot with Sweeney on both atomic missions, and also signed by two Hibakusha. I'm very careful with this, so I've been told it's worth a lot. This is what it looks like across the river, and what you can't see in this photograph because it's too light out. There are steps here, and you can see these steps are wet, and there's a tide that's starting to go down. Well, I was waiting. I had calculated ahead of time. I wanted to take a photograph that would define where Little Boy was. And since I did that for a living for 30 years, I thought I could do it. Where Little Boy was in the sky relative to that A-bomb dome, because that dome has been photographed millions of times. But I wanted to do something that was unique, something that hadn't been done before. And so I decided to use the sun as a substitute, because they're both nuclear, they're roughly the same temperature when they exploded, and it would encapsulate exactly where it was. So I had about a half-hour window. I used Google Earth and sun position calculators, and I used all of the data from the Hiroshima people there. They know almost to the cubic yard where Little Boy was when it exploded. It's probably the most studied event in history. So I had a window, and I walked down that bridge and went up to the Aoi Bridge. And when I turned the corner, what I hadn't anticipated was that the shadows on the bridge were the same shadows that would have been cast by Little Boy when it exploded. And anybody on that bridge would have seen those shadows in that fraction of just a few seconds before they disappeared forever. And I slowly turned to see my own shadow, and I'm going to get emotional. It hit me pretty hard, because all of a sudden, unexpected again, all these memories of what all the descriptions from the people who were in those planes, 3 planes, looked down and saw large pieces of debris getting sucked up into that cloud. Even from 6 miles up, they could see it. They all told me, I knew 6 people inside the Enola Gay and 8 from inside a boxcar, the strike plane for Nagasaki. They're all passed away now. They all told me if the Emperor could only see what we're seeing right now, he would pull the plug on the war. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. So I was really I was tearing up pretty bad, and I glanced up, and here is a young Japanese woman, cell phone up to her ear, other arm in an animated conversation, and I gathered from her dress and her hair and makeup and so on that she was probably an acolyte of Lady Gaga. And I realized, and it snapped me out of it, I realized that Hiroshima is a modern, vibrant 21st century city. They've completely recovered from what happened. They've been reborn, life goes on, and it will go on in case something terrible happens again. So I followed Lady Gaga across the bridge. She kept on going. I went down the walkway, and this is the photograph showing basically that it went off directly overhead. Now, what I'm going to get, if you will allow me just a few minutes, and I mentioned this to John last night, Tinian is relatively unknown. Tinian's code name was Destination in all of the documents that I went through over the year. I've seen Destination mentioned hundreds of times. 5 years ago when we were there, along with Nancy and Roger Mead here from the lab, to be part of a day-long Manhattan Project seminar, at the end of the night, the keynote speech was delivered by 4-star Air Force General Howie Chandler.